raising memories. And because of his depth of knowledge, he will summarize what has happened and how our enemies have been writing about the history. And I leave the opportunity of explaining his topic to Dr. Buluma. Dr. Buluma, you can take the stage. You are on mute.
Yes. Thank you for a second for correcting me, and thank you for I will yes, I'll talk about history, writing history with vengeance. I have to explain a little bit what I mean, and after I go through my PowerPoint, I believe you will realize why I use that word. And also silencing voices and erasing memories. Maybe just before I start at this moment, let me talk a little bit about voices and memories. Here I'm using voices about the materials, the sources that historians use to write history, which means that these voices could be both active and silent. There are the voices that people produce when they are alive, if they have the skills to write it down. Maybe they could come down to us through what they had written, what they have expressed about themselves and about their environment and about their time. In other cases, they may not have the writing skills, but whatever they do, the materials they use, the pieces that they leave behind, which archaeologists dig out and piece together, are also voices or traces of the past. The memories are what we have after the voices are left behind, or in fact, we're even at the which are being produced all the time. So the historians also use these memories in addition to the voices, and connect the two to reconstruct the history of a society in the past. But when you disconnect or silence the voices and erase the memories, you don't have any history to talk about. And history, maybe this might not be quite clear immediately to the professional or not in the profession of history, to the ordinary people. There is a connection with history of that we know in power. Because power creates sources or voices or privileges some voices over others. And therefore, the voices of the powerful are heard louder, and the voices of those without power are silenced and therefore forgotten or not remembered. That's how, in fact, as the Haitian historian anthropologist Michel Trulot says, history or sources for history are not created equal. There are power differentials. So that's what we deal here in Oromo history, and that's what I'm going to talk about. To do this, I'll start with the present, the time that we are in, that we know very well, that we are living, that we are experiencing, and go back and forth in my presentation. If we may say, in fact, there was a brief promising moment in 2018 We are not quite sure about that right now because it doesn't exist anymore. That at that moment, we felt, the Oromo people, at least some of them, felt some promise. But all those are now gone, and we are now experiencing the most difficult time in our recent history. Oddly, what we are experiencing today is actually happening under the leadership of those who claim to have some connections or root in Oromo society. But this leadership is stifling dissent, imprisoning prominent politicians, activists, and their supporters, almost everybody, anyone. This has emboldened some Amhara intellectuals who are attacking Oromo history and culture and scholarship. Speaking of history, until recently, Oromo history was limited to the post-15th century. Anything that is told, if it's told at all, is actually post-15th century. This is based on the narrative of an Abyssinian monk, Abba Bahiri, that Ethiopian scholars had accepted that the Oromo, the appearance of the Oromo on the historical scene in the early 16th century. But linguistic evidences have clearly indicated that the Oromo are one of the oldest Cushitic-speaking peoples who had been living in northeastern Africa on the same territory that they inhabit today for thousands of years. The settlement of the Eastern Cushitic language speakers, that includes the Oromo, or actually the Cushitic speakers, the Oromo are actually part of the lowland Eastern Cushitic. Preceded the arrival of the Ethio-Semitic language speakers, that includes the Amhara, Tigrinya, Gurage, and other Ethio-Semitic languages. The Harari also included in this. This is, I don't know if you see it clearly on your side. This is a map I just took from Christopher Ehret's, one of his articles, who is a well-known authority, sociolinguistic sociolinguist. He's been teaching at UCLA for several decades. According to him and other, in fact, linguists, the Cushitic speakers largely concentrated in the Northeast Africa, spread from what is today in northeastern Sudan, or in northern part or north of Eritrea, to the south, along the highlands, or between the Afar lowlands and the Blue Nile Gorge to the south, towards the Great Lakes region and farther into East Africa. Some of them are now in Kenya and Tanzania. The Oromo were part of this. They are divided into north, central, eastern, and southern. As I've said, the Oromo are in the middle of this, and they, or at least that's where they are concentrated in the south of the Blue Nile and the Kenyan border. So they have been there for thousands of years. This is says it's between 5,000 to 4,000 millennium, which is about now 6,000 to 7,000 years ago. probably even earlier. Let me add here some clarification about the Shuang Plateau. That's where, or south of that, where the greater concentration of the, or probably the origin of the Eastern Cushitic speaking populations took place, including the Oromo. I do this because this region had served as a major point of contact between the speakers of various languages and followers of different religions since at least the medieval period. It has also served, in fact, as a contact for trade for a very long time. And right now, it's also the point of controversy, as we all know, largely, in fact, related to Finfinne. It's located at this center, at this region. And there are many, in fact, contending to have or claiming to have precedence over that place outside the Oromani. But who lived in the Shuang Plateau before the speakers of the Amharic language arrived after the 10th century AD? Earlier Ethiopians had assumed that the early settlers of the Shuang region were the Sidama people, but they did not provide much evidence and explanation about that. The term Sidama, in fact, should not be confused with the people who now live around Lake Hawassa. The term was coined by Ethiopianists. I mean, these are people who study about Ethiopian history and culture, both foreigners as well as Ethiopians. That the term was coined in the early 20th century to refer to the people who live south of the Blue Nile and Jama River. That's in northern, the boundary in the northern shore between Wollo and shore, northern shore. But they are linguistically, in fact, classified into Cushitic and Omotic speakers. But apparently, those who coined this term didn't include the Oromo or the Somali. At that time, actually, the current linguistic classification into Cushitic and Omotic also didn't exist. Actually, it came in the 1970s with a refinement of the linguistic classification. So in the southwest now, there are people concentrating in the lower Omo Valley are the Omotic, classified as Omotic. But it's now clear that the Oromo had already, in fact, been living or lived in the Shuang Plateau for a very long time before the arrival of the Ethio-Semitic speakers, particularly the Amharic speakers in 10th or after the 10th century. This has been attested by Makriya Bulicha and Muhammad Hassan, our senior scholars, using multiple sources, including written as well as oral sources. For example, one such source, which has been used by various scholars, that the hagiographer of a 14th century saint of the Ethiopian Orthodox Church mentions this, that the saints made the inhabitants of the country worshipping the devil at the foot of a cobble tree, which Muhammad and I agree with him that this apparently the auditory, that they were worshipping, he says, the devil, that's his own, under the cobalt tree. They were sitting there, eating, drinking, amusing themselves in the fashion of the Muslims. He didn't say they were Muslims, but in the fashion of the Muslims. They found the fire with their hands and held the flames in their mouths and chanted, saying, "Oh, people of Galan and Yaya, see what your god Korke," says Korke, but apparently this is Olge, "can do." And they brought for their god or for themselves 2 fat cows, 5 sheep, 5 goats, and 21 baskets of bread. All these were eaten by the functionaries of the gods. So I think this clearly suggests that these were Oromo. The very fact that Galan and Yaya were mentioned, these are still in fact the population group whose descendants still live in the same place. The place that the hagiographer was referring to is actually somewhere in the neighborhood of Infinne today, or to the east of it. So these are not actually the only evidences that we have. Mohammed Hassan has identified numerous documents from the hagiographies and the chronicles of the medieval Christian kings that allude to the Oromo clan names. Futu al-Habasha is the chronicle of Ahmed Ibrahim Grain. In the 16th century, also mentions numerous personal, clan, and place names, unmistakably Oromo. Furthermore, Makria had made an extensive inventory of the place names and clan names, which are clearly Oromo, or probably a little bit distorted, but originally Oromo names. This has always been there, actually. Also, none of the Ethiopian scholars had ever looked at or interpreted these names as referring to Oromo. Many of them actually have studied or looked at these names from the great Italian Ethiopianists like Enrico Cerulli or Conti Rossini, or Ethiopian scholars like Meridwald Aragai and Taddese Tamrat. These are actually pioneering modern Ethiopian historians have looked at it, but they never in fact thought or believed that these were Oromo names. They looked at different things, and in fact there were a lot of misinterpretation. In fact, one serious disadvantage that all these scholars had, which Makria, who didn't have that limitation, was actually the language barrier. And the second one was actually the assumption that the Oromo didn't exist in this area or didn't live in this area before what Abba Bahre had written in the late 16th century. So why look for the people who are apparently not there? Or why associate the name to the people? That's in fact the assumption. So one, in fact, it started from the assumption that they didn't live there before the 16th century. And second, in fact, these people didn't have the language ability to easily detect what these names say. So By that time, in fact, apparently the Oromo are as large as today. In fact, not, of course, the population has grown a lot since then. But even comparatively, I think, relatively to other ethnic groups, they were larger. They were identified with the different names that Mercury has correctly identified. But they were there. That contrary to these sources, Ethiopians have ignored the presence of the Oromo north of the Middle Awash, or in fact the modern central the Shuam Plateau before the 16th century. Until the 1960s and 70s, the dominant narrative of Ethiopian history followed Abba Bahre's 16th century account. Following him, Ethiopians continued to portray the Oromo as intruders into the Ethiopian region. For example, representing the Ethiopianist position, both foreign and domestic, Edward Ollendorff not only considered the Oromo as newcomers, but he blamed them for the political turmoil of the Zemene Mesafint. In his book published in 1960, he said, the Oromo had nothing to contribute to Ethiopian civilization. They possessed no material or intellectual culture, and their social organization was at a far lower stage of development than that of the population among whom they settled. Well, this is the passage often quoted and quite familiar to historians and educated Oromos to a large extent know this. So why am I bringing this really old, discarded passage from Ollendorff, which he himself actually admitted before he died when he reviewed Muhammad Hassan's book that he was wrong. But such historical narrative was at the time challenged by young Oromo scholars. By the 1970s, these young Oromo scholars confronted Ollendorff and other Ethiopianists that advanced the great tradition of imperial Ethiopia, which is the main narrative or the meta-narrative of Ethiopian history. In fact, here maybe I would like to mention an incident. I myself, in fact, was not there, but I heard this from students and colleagues when I was at Addis Ababa University, that when Ollendorff came to lecture at Addis Ababa University after he received the Haile Selassie first, the Haile Selassie Trust Prize for his scholarship on Ethiopian history, he was confronted by a young Oromo student who quoted, in fact, from his book, which I just shared with you, and why he said that. In fact, I was told that there was an uproar in the class among the radical student body at the time, ridiculing Ollendorff for his comments. So that the challenge was in fact quite played out in the public, that the authority of such historians in fact had been challenged by young scholars. That's in fact showing the changing trend at the time. But Oromo students in fact did not stop there, or challenging their professors in the classroom or commenting on their books. In fact, they wrote or prepared their senior essays, in which I myself have participated, and in fact had supervised numerous essays when I was at Addis Ababa University, particularly in the 1980s actually. Almost all Oromo students who I remember who then joined the history department ended up writing something in their senior essays. All these are actually, as far as I know, were deposited both at the Department of History at Addis Ababa University and the Institute of Ethiopian Studies. I believe they are still there. And researchers, in fact, have exploited, although they are just senior essays. But many went on, actually. Many of these students went on to get their graduate degrees, including myself and my colleagues here, still in this audience, have continued their studies after acquiring the more training on historical methodology, and produced some of the foundational books on Oromo history today. I'm talking about Muhammad Hassan and Makuriya Bulcha and Asafa Jalataur in this audience now, and many others. And still, in fact, that trend is still continuing. So by the 1990s, actually, many things have happened. It's not only, in fact, challenging professors in the classroom or writing senior essays, but now we have books, or the publication of Bonnie Holcomb and Sisai Ibsa, The Invention of Ethiopia, Muhammad Hassan's The History of the Oromo, all started, in fact, by the 1990s. And the establishment of Oromo Studies Association, the publication of the Journal of Oromo Studies, trying to overcome all these the problems in Oromo history, the silences that existed in Ethiopian history in the past. So we thought, in fact, we are making progress. But unfortunately, lately, some Ethiopians have started writing with vengeance. That's where I come with this work. The vengeance is, in fact, erasing or reversing the progress in the scholarship of Oromo studies. The books and the articles that Oromo scholars, or I have to say scholars of the Oromo, have accomplished over the last 30, 40 years. In some cases, the critiques of the Oromo scholarship go beyond the normal academic debates to total rejection of or direct attack on both the scholar and their works. Unfortunately, the purpose of such style of history writing is aimed at suppressing dissent or dissenting voices and erasing historical memories that contradict the meta-narrative of Ethiopian history. Let me explain this by using one of the latest publications by historian Abtamu Mengistetegn. A book just came out, and Barara, Kadamit Addis Ababa, Barara, the first Addis Ababa. This is in Amharic. Those of you who have read it know what I'm going to talk about briefly. This is not, in fact, really a very serious review of the book, which the author himself, in fact, suggested to me a few weeks ago when we both appeared on a virtual conference on medieval history. But I have to tell you, for those of you who have not read it, it's a very difficult book, particularly for the Oromo, or to read. I know the author, although we were there at different times. but he came through the history department at Addis Ababa University. He started under Donald Krami, a highly respected Ethiopianist and Africanist scholar, historian, who had trained some of my colleagues, and in fact, of whom I have interacted with, although I was not his student, and I highly respect his work. But Abtamu himself, in fact, has produced other works, which I have to admit, I have to say, were sound, scholarly sound works. But this one, this particular one, the one he just wrote in Amharic, was actually not the kind that I've expected from him. It's very, to me, it's very disappointing text. Also, he has collected several research materials to reconstruct the history of a short-lived medieval town of Barara in central Shoa and Plateau. The author spent a lot of energy to prove that Barara was the first Addis Ababa, the city established by King Menelik in 1886, about 350 years after Barara had disappeared. Instead of focusing on Barara in a proper historical context, the author turned it to a political propaganda in the name of scholarship. First, he turned it to politics by connecting Barara to the modern city of Addis Ababa or Finfinne, which, as I've said, in fact, was found more about 350, 400 years after the first one disappeared. But Barara was neither a permanent capital of the medieval Christian kings nor a major trading center of huge importance. In fact, I've written a commentary when the author of this book first wrote an article claiming Barara is Addis Ababa. In fact, my rebuttal was Barara is not Addis Ababa. Some of you, all of you might have read that. If you didn't, you can still search and read, where I have argued that the Barara that's now claimed to be in the same place where the modern city of Finfinne is built is not actually the case. Although the town did exist in the neighborhood of Finfinne, maybe to the southeast of it, but we have not yet, in fact, found the exact location of it. There was an archaeologist actually doing an active work, and in 1917-18, I have some exchanges with him on the progress that he was making, and unfortunately, I don't hear from him lately. I don't know, or probably they might have denied him to continue his work on the search of the true Barara, because the dominant voice now, in fact, trying hard to really connect Barara with Finfinne is really working hard. But the town existed for maybe about 150 years from the late 14th century to the early 16th century. But in fact, like many other medieval towns, had disappeared. It didn't survive after the 16th century. But for sure, I'm saying unless we see concrete evidence that it was really built on the same location of modern Finfinne, Addis Ababa, I still don't believe it's in fact in the same location. But anyhow, the author, I think Abtamu actually does a lot of, brings a lot of discussion into this, turning this small medieval town into actually a great city probably in the African context, comparable to Timbuktu, on maybe even other towns in other parts of the world. It says it has a connection both to the east, as far as India, Persia, or into Europe, Western Europe, including Western Europe, to Spain and Portugal. I'll leave that maybe for a future discussion. But anyhow, he has a purpose to do this. What he is capitalizing on is actually making this, the history of this town and connecting with the modern Finfinne, and in fact, increasing or boosting the Amara elites' claim that in fact they had been there and they built the precursor of the modern Finfinne, and therefore they are entitled to everything on which these cities, modern cities, built and the area. So disregarding the recent history. But second, in fact, half of Tegenyu's book is actually an attack on Oromo scholars and the Oromo people and their institutions. He also, in fact, it's about 500-page book, so about 250 is actually an attack, two chapters in particular, in fact, an attack on the Gada system and on the Mogasa institution of the Oromo, turning both of them and other Oromo institutions, in fact, cherished Oromo institutions, into something different that we don't know, and something negative. So it's totally a misrepresentation of the people's institution. But in addition to that, in fact, he attacks everyone, not everyone in a sense, but he selectively attacks prominent Oromo scholars who had written something positive about Oromo history or about these Oromo institutions, but he does it selectively. His target is, in fact, his prime target is frequently cites in a very negative way Muhammad Hassan's work, Asafa Jallata's, but for some reasons he forgets to refer to Makria Bulicha's. I don't know, probably, I don't believe he has not seen it, but probably intimidated, didn't have the time to read voluminous work. So he doesn't say much about that. He also doesn't say much about, or not at all, about actually non-Oromo scholars who are working, have worked on the Oromo institutions. He mentions Asma Romulagese, but not much in a negative way, although he refutes everything positive about what these scholars have written. So he actually refers to the Oromo as newcomers or intruders, like Bahre did in the 16th century, and all other Ethiopian scholars have done until the 1970s and 80s. He actually uses this term. That's why I wrote it in Amharic here, actually. He says the Oromo, after the 16th century, has evicted or suppressed the indigenous people who were there before. He calls Nanabar or Kadami Hizboj, which means people who had lived there before the Oromo. But as I've indicated earlier, actually the Oromo had been there ever since probably they had emerged as an Oromo, distinct Oromo identity. They have never moved. And in fact, the linguistic evidences, and if we are able to get more archaeological evidences in the future, although that has not been done in the past, probably will definitely prove this. The material is already there. And even the Christian documents, the chronicles, the hagiographies, as I've mentioned earlier, in fact, prove this. But anyhow, the author of this book, Barara, actually says there were Nabar Hizbor, Kadami Hizboj, before the Oromo. But he doesn't indicate actually on what grounds he considers the Oromo as newcomers and from where they suddenly appeared on the scene before the 16th century. He says he doesn't want to get into that and simply referring to a lot has been done. But in fact, the author's major attempt is actually the argument that twists and in a very mean way tries to misrepresent Oromo institutions like Gada and Mogasa. He argues that Gada was an institution, a militarized institution that contributed to the destruction of non-Oromo populations. Mogasa he portrays as an assimilationist that boosted the Oromo population at the expense of others. He claims both institutions created cultural genocide. Surprisingly, actually, he refers to the same literature that Dr. Alamayo, Professor Alamayo, actually discussed earlier, the same authority. But he completely twists everything and says this is what the Oromo did to other people in the region. So essentially, he's actually turning the victims into victimizers. The victims, as Professor Mokwe has already explained, who were actually attacked in the 19th century, late 19th century, by Milik's conquerors, Milik's army, who lost their land, who lost their family members, who were sold into slavery. And for the Oromo, actually, no, that was not the case. They were the ones who did this earlier. That's, in fact, the purpose. So let me quickly, in fact, say this, and I will end. Why did, in fact, this author and other elites, Amara elite, I have to say, attack Oromo institutions and the scholars, or the Oromo, in fact, and the scholars? I have some points. I think the purpose is by branding the Oromo institutions as tools of genocide and attacking the scholarship about the history and culture of the Oromo. It's intended to confuse the legitimate historical debate and suppress alternative voices and silence new interpretations. By attacking Oromo scholars and their works, they are trying to blur the recent memories of violence and genocide perpetrated by Menelik. Actually, I have to correct this, by Menelik.
Excuse me, Professor
Okay,
Buruma, we are almost over by 20 minutes, so please, if you could round it up, that would be great.
Okay, I'm done. I'm done. Okay, I'm sorry for that. Okay, so the second point is by denying Oromo presence on the land before the arrival of the Christian Amhara in the south central region of Shoa, trying to justify that Menelik conquest of the late 19th century and the land alienations were actually legitimate. So forget the present by just going back and denying even the very existence of the people on the land centuries ago. The more importantly, I think this is also aimed at historical justification over the claim over Finfinne today, that the Oromo rights, and in fact, making the people forget those who have been evicted from the land when the city was first established and still continue to be evicted from the neighborhood of the city. It's also an attempt to confuse the scholarship with political rhetoric and rewrite history. And finally, in fact, presenting Barara as a precursor of Addis Ababa, I think this is, in fact, justification. But I think there is a huge problem, which my colleagues have already identified. Turning history into this kind of polemic would first, in fact, undermine the value of history itself as historical knowledge, as a knowledge that the society needs to connect itself to the past, understand itself, and chart its future. Such publications also increase, in fact, the tension between the ordinary people. And ultimately, in fact, I'm afraid what Mokria had already identified, maybe be inviting or making the environment conducive for some kind of genocide, if it had not started yet. So that I think the danger we are in, and that's what had happened and happening right now. And that's what I call, in fact, writing history with vengeance, silencing voices and erasing memories. Thank you. Sorry for going over time.
Thank you, Dr. Guluma. We really appreciate the insight that you brought to us, how the opponents of the Oromo people are trying to silence the voices of the Oromos, and how they are trying to misinterpret and try to just justify.
Dr. Riley, you're still there.
Kick me out. How the opponents of the Oromo people are trying to misuse different concepts to justify the genocide that is going on. And we really appreciate your insight, and we appreciate the work that you have done. And with this, we'll go to question and answers. And I think the first person who has raised his hand is Dr. Workney. We will give this chance to Dr. Workney. Dr. Workney, please take the mic.
Thank you so much, Dr. Haile, and thank you, Dr. Guluma, for the interesting information. My question is about the book that Tegenyi wrote. You said the fact that he included in the book called Barbara is very disappointing. What I know in science is that when somebody writes a manuscript based on bad data or something which is not fact-based, it can be taken down. How you guys challenge somebody who writes a book that is not fact-based and being used as a propaganda to attack other ethnic groups?
Okay. I think.
Do you want me to respond, or maybe take other questions as well?
I couldn't raise my hand, Dr. Haide.
Okay. Well, please Can you respond to this before we go?
Okay, all right, I will do, yes. Well, thank you, Dr. Workene. Let's take it this way. Normally in scholarship, you know this very well too, particularly for historians and other social scientists, when someone writes something that doesn't actually really meet to the scholarly standard for political propaganda purposes, historians tend to shy away from it, don't even review it, because others will respond, the politicians maybe you're targeted to. So I think as a historian, we actually enter into this debate reluctantly. It's not the choice, because it's totally attacking people, scholars with in their works unfairly. So you have to respond. And secondly, also in fact, on behalf of our people, we are forced to respond. But normally, in fact, you don't even need to, but others could respond politically with the same weight. You review the kind of work that has contributed something that you feel maybe has missed some other things. So it actually is for the benefit of the reading public and the scholarly community for further improvement and the broadening of historical knowledge. You review or you criticize. It's not to attack the individual or the work. It's for improvement. Because I say something actually in the written part I didn't include in the PowerPoint is the scholarly enterprise is not a win-lose work. It's a win-win, ideally. So when you react to someone's work, you are actually encouraging the person and the others to do more. And you yourself, in fact, by reacting to it, you do something or strive to do something better. It's not by pulling down someone. But here, in fact, since we are forced to comment on it and take the challenge, we have to point out. In fact, I believe you read the book. When you see it, he cites a number of sources. Some of them, in fact, are previously not used. But what bothered me, in fact, as a historian, is, in fact, the selection of sources to make a point, not to promote scholarship. One very important point, I know I don't have much time, but I have to point out, those of you reading the book will see is, for example, the argument that he uses on the Cushitic origin, or actually what it takes into the Afro-Asiatic language families, which Cushitic is one of them, in fact, one of the 6 Afro-Asiatic languages. He brings out this argument, the Afro-Asiatic origin argument, which most credible linguists, sociolinguists, I know, like Christopher Ehret and others actually believe that the origin of the Afro-Asiatic was actually somewhere between the Middle Nile and the Red Sea region, and in northeastern Sudan, or maybe southern Egypt, and from where they spread out to the south, to the east, into Asia, and to the west, North Africa, including, in fact, Morocco and all others, is the Berber language, and the Hausa Chadic language into West Africa. These are all part of the larger Afro-Asiatic, which is actually one of the largest language families. Cushitic is one of them. But he takes this argument, actually taken by recently mostly Ethiopian and linguists, and argues that actually Afro-Asiatic originated in southwestern Ethiopia. And says, okay, so which means the Semitic, who actually Mukria mentioned earlier, I like that young person, young in the 1950s, now in fact an old diplomat, I believe, said most of the Amharic people actually took pride in being coming from Saudi Arabia, because that was in fact considered to be of higher civilization and all these things. That's actually what that person in the interview actually reflected in the 1950s. Now they have shifted. They just want to forget, and actually want us to forget, that South Arabian connection and the migration from Saudi Arabia, which the linguists still believe. But they say, oh no, originated in southwestern Ethiopia, all Afro-Asiatic language, including Amharic and others, the Ethio-Semitic language. So, but where actually that argument is still not clear and has not made it is, okay, how that makes the Oromo outsiders or newcomers to the place, where all other Ethio-Semitic, even if we accept that, where all other Afro-Asiatic language actually originates there. But actually, it doesn't make that, or I don't think they will be able to make that argument. But he says, he moves on, oh, that's a very distance. In fact, we don't need to use language to prove this. Actually, we have to use state formation and civilization.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Guluma.
All right, okay, thanks.
Because since most of the argument they are coming up is fake, it is very difficult to justify a lot of whatever they are coming up with. I think because of time shortage, I think it's better to take all the questions, and if most of these questions are the same, it's better to respond to it at one time. And we appreciate the explanation that is given. And because of the time shortage we have, let us go to Dr. Hambisa and then Dr. Tess Banti, Dr. Desalen, and Obo Imuro. Please bring your questions or your comments. And of course, before that, Dr. Someone else has requested.
This me, you mean
let us start with Dr. Makria's comment or question, and then the rest of you guys can continue.
Mr. Imuru will be the last person to ask question. After that, please, that's not, people have tolerated us. So after Imuru, no more question. Unless, of course, if anybody wants to also stay or hang around, no problem. We can continue. Officially, we will end it after Imru's question.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Aile. Thank you, Guluma. A good presentation, broad. Your question, why do they attack Oromo? Not just scholarship, but the Oromo at this moment is something we should know. As you said, Oromo students from Addis Ababa University have been confronting whatever has been written. That should be studied, in fact, by students who write their papers. Because Oromo students from the 70s, they write on Oromo when they write their senior essays. That is a fantastic, thing to recognize. Well, anyway, why do they attack? Before they used to just joke at us. They thought if they just keep on with suppressing language and history, we will disappear as identity, as a nation. That failed. We didn't recognize that, but they see that. Now what do they do? They have to just attack you and say, no, you are wrong, your book is wrong, your article is wrong, what you are saying is wrong about yourself. And this is the only weapon they have now. Distortion, insulting. That we should understand. The other thing, of course, about the Shuan Plateau, there is a lot to do, to work on still, like you said. But you know, places like Korke, that one is there still today. You'll be surprised if you look at this archaeologist or pseudo-archaeologist, what is his name, is writing a lot, and this guy has just translated his articles into Amharic. This guy you are talking about at last. On one of the articles he has written, or sort of articles he always writes, Korke is there. Korke is old Korke. And I think it is related to what they call Sidai, but Sida. It's the same area, and I guess what happened was the church, they built, when they came and occupied that area after, what was his name, Yukuno and there's the second one. When they built that church, they built on that place, on where this tree was, where the Oromo were worshipping, where Korke is. Korke is a big field now. It is, you see there is a photograph. So the area is there, and the Shuan Plateau has to be studied, and it's because of Infinite that this big debate is going on. But this debate, we should win this debate. We should win intellectually. Of course, when it comes to the last resort, we have to use whatever means is available for our to protect our rights. That is what I wanted to say. And there is a lot of work to do. Some people who are young here and who should research in that area.
Okay, thank you. Dr. Hambisa?
All right, thank you so very much. I just want to thank the presenters for wonderful and educational presentation. And I have a question that could be to any one of the presenters. We know that Ethiopia was created as a dependent colonial state by the European powers in the 19th century. And what they did agree was that they want to keep the status quo in Ethiopia as is. And since it is creation, they have been providing military, economic, and diplomatic coverage and help. And we know that too, that Ethiopia wouldn't stay in power, any government would not stay in power if it was not for the assistance of the West and the US. So what the Ethiopians are doing now, the Amharas are doing now, is trying to appeal to those Western friends they have kept for over two centuries. So, and the West, including the US, is willing to listen to them, is willing to help, is willing to give credence to their false cries. And so what do we need to do so that we would chip into this this biased, probably repressive assistance that the West is providing to those people. Thank you.
Thank you. And Luba Banti.
Thank you, Dr. Guluma. I know the historians know many things about the past. It was really wonderful, but I have a question about your erasing memory. That's what you said about erasing memory. Do we have, as a nation and as intellectuals, do we have short memory? I don't know whether you can answer this question. Short memory, forgetting what has happened the day before. I say that, you understand why I'm saying that. When I was living in the country, there was Galaga Day, organized by this Nafenya group, and these people killed Darara Kafane and continued Jagama Batan and so forth in Ambo. I mean, there are in many places in Tembi also, I know. And what has happened in 2018, the Ambo people forgot it, what has happened, and rewarded those killers. And I remember what Isat was saying, ye Ambo soch rasunde ye ada ye Darara Kafanin mot lamin dino da chana na intin yeshallam wato nazin ya hunu chun Dr. Abiyin na Obolama. So we can blame others. We have time to reflect on our own repeated mistakes. My question, as a historian, what do we do? Or do we just accept history repeats itself? So it has to repeat. Governors after governors should come and betray their own people. Then we say history should repeat itself. Or is there a way that we think as a group, as a nation, as Oromo, and plan for the future? Thank you.
Thank you, Lubanti. Dr. Desari.
Oh, thank you, Dr. Haile. I have a question and a comment. I will start with my comment. My comment for maybe Professor Dr. Guluma and the others who are in the audience. I am part of the Oromo students at Addis Ababa University, where the Ethiopian history are always made up. So I'm one of the challenging, I'm part of the group who are challenging the history department in Addis Ababa University, which has been producing lots of mythologies about histories, especially that focuses on the rulers. And from the rulers, focusing on the northern part of the country, which is focusing on the Habesha group. These were part of the curriculum in Addis Ababa University for a long time, where students have been challenging. Every time you take a course called History of the Ethiopia, and that was the point of contention for classes. So I was part of that, where we, especially in 1998, 2000, 2003, all you heard about that stories of the Oromo student movement in challenging this. I want to mention about Asafa Jalata and Muhammad Hassan, who are instrumental for us to cite our argument and points, especially in challenging and deconstructing the knowledge that, the mythology that they were producing. And finally, this has brought, got attention in the university, which find challenge in the Department of History at Addis Ababa University, even to the level that change the narrative, writing of history. Because I'm part of I was part of the university. I was a student, I was a professor in the university for a long time. So it has challenges. I don't know how much you have a document about this. And second, when I come to the question, this is about the methodological issue I have for historians, not only for Dr. Guluma, all the historians. How do you take mythologies as history and document in scholarly text. Because the reason I'm mentioning that is one of the mythologies that they have been creating about ethnic groups in the country, and the major focus is also on Oromo, is some of them are very far from reality, which was made by especially the clergies in the church. Probably Professor Makura has said earlier, clergies in the church, and some people who can produce, as you know, they are called journalists. They can write in their language, and they have the resources to promote as true history. So my question is, how do historians consider mythologies as history? What are the tools that you use to check whether this is really a scholarly debate? Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Bessalin. A lot of questions are coming. Okay, let's go to Imru. Final question.
Thank you very much, Dr. Haile. I thank Dr. Guluma for his insightful presentation also. As was explained, Abba Bahre and many other Abyssinian historians denied our existence before the 16th century. And thanks to Professor Makure and also Professor Muhammad, who defended us. I remember what was written by Dr. Nagaso Gidada that said something about the 16th century. In fact, which looks like accepting their claim, which the Abyssinians always quote, many times. I mean, they quote all the time, saying that even Dr. Nagaso Gidada said the Oromos existed after the 16th century. So when now I'm a bit, afraid, if we say Barara existed as a town before the 16th century, but a little bit far away from Finfinne, my question is to Dr. Guluma, don't you think that this will be quoted, as a reference, as if, I mean, just as accepting their the claim that they are carrying out now? Yeah, thanks.
All right. Okay. Thank you, everybody. Thank you for good questions. I hope you'll bear with me if I try to answer each question as much as possible. We may not have that much time, but probably I'll try to cover all of them.
Try to summarize in.
Yeah, I'll try. Yes. Okay. First, maybe starting with Makuya's comments and his suggestions that we should take up this very seriously and meet the challenge by doing more research and maybe inviting more young scholars to develop research projects addressing these issues, and particularly, in fact, focusing on the Shan Plateau. This is a very important geographical historical site. Of course, you remember what I mentioned. I did it with intention about how sources are created unequal, how power distorts historical narratives. If you remember, maybe no, I didn't mention this, but if I may mention very quickly, in the early 1880s, when Milik's army was hovering around Indoto, and they eventually and he put his camp there before moving down the hill to the present city. And they were coming up with all sorts of stories about which are now in fact becoming used as kind of historical evidence. So the priests actually went to the king and said, "Oh, this is where your great-great-grandfather, Emperor Daud, actually had his palace." So he commissioned an amateur archaeologist, not an archaeologist actually, just to dig and find an evidence. They were creating evidence where it didn't exist earlier. So whatever they did, in fact, nothing was recorded, nothing was found, but they left that story, which is mentioned in his chronicle by the chronicler Daguuggaa Sanyii.
It's an interesting conference. 11 Jamrono. والله كيف أجر قل كمال لا ألمنو كأستراليا كسويدن.
Who is talking, guys?
Yeah, somebody, can you, Jamal, could you
continue?
Mute?
Okay, all right. Anyhow, so I think some of the sources, some of the evidence can be created. Some of the existing evidences could be lost. So we create an even narration. So we have to try to lead out. And archaeological work has not been done. A very promising start was made in the early 20th century by two French archaeologists, but that project was discontinued until very recently. So we don't know what's actually hidden down, and some of it would forever be lost, particularly as the city expands and things are actually cleaned out and buried under the buildings, modern buildings, we may not find. But there are, that's why there is an urgency in Makria's suggestion for young scholars to take up and to do our best to recover them and to document it. And the question he raised is quite interesting. Why do they attack us? Actually, in the actual paper I wrote, I say something. In the past, they didn't need to attack you directly. Of course, they attacked us in many ways, but not in a very vicious way that we are seeing from some people. I don't mean to generalize to everybody, but some who are doing it. Makria is right, Professor Makria is right. They are attacking because now they realize the power we have, the ability, the skill that we have to refute this and give an alternative narrative interpretation, plausible, based on evidences. But when at that time actually they were joking at us, but now in fact it's no more a joke. It's a real serious attack on the scholarship, on the people, on the institution, everything. It's a very dangerous one. I think it shows also the vulnerability they are facing. It's not the strength, it's the vulnerability and loss of the power that they used to have, and also the skills and the abilities that we have started to develop to meet this on the playing field. So that I'm thinking, but we have to do better. But actually, they can win over, and in fact, wrong, false narratives can be in fact be accepted as true narratives. So I think we have to understand that. There's the second one by Dr. Ambisa about, in fact, appealing to the West, how the West had been won and how they have provided the resources earlier, like for Milik, the firearms by which he conquered the people and subdued and took the land. And now, in fact, the diplomatic and other things. Actually, I would go farther than 200 years. That goes back actually to the 15th or rather the 16th century, when the first direct encounter with Europeans through the Jesuit missionaries and the Portuguese soldiers happened. At one time, although those Portuguese and missionaries were in the country for a while and had opportunity to meet and learn directly more about the Oromo, they did to some extent, but actually they took the narrative of the Ethiopian clergy like Bahire and others and created a narrative that continued to be dominant, remain dominant until today. So they are using that actually earlier contacts, earlier well-established narrative, which the Europeans received through the Christian, the Ethiopian elite and the clergy in particular. And the same thing was used actually in the 19th century to access firearms and to gain diplomatic acceptance support to suppress the local population. We have never been able to overcome that. We have never developed the resources and the skills and the diplomatic ability to persuade, and then have not done enough. That's what we are suffering from right now, and that's what we are facing. So obviously we have to do more. We have to be able to show the alternative explanations. We don't need to be represented or misrepresented. We have to be able to represent ourselves, our reality, and I think if we do our best, I hope we will overcome this challenge as well. I don't know what I can't recommend any specific things, but it's a collective challenge and a collective response should be found. Dr. Banji, about memory, whether we are actually forgetting even the most recent experiences. Well, memory is a very complex thing. Yes, we forget, sometimes even the most recent ones. At other times, we don't forget. For historical purposes, the Oromo had a very elaborate way of remembering. In fact, some of the books recently published show, and we also from our own personal experience know, which the anthropologist Asmaro Legacy says the triple accounting system of recording historical facts that can go back, even orally, that can go back into hundreds of years, at least more accurately for at least some 500 years. And then I'll come, in fact, how we can remember more beyond that. But we can also forget the more recent ones. But the case that Dr. Banti raised is not actually forgetting. I think people remember it. It's just a fact that happened today. But it all depends who is actually telling it. The people that they brought together to give awards, to give recognition to the same people who had victimized the people, are persuaded for one reason or another. It doesn't mean that the Oromo people at large forgot it. They do remember. It's a fact. It was there yesterday. They don't have that kind of amnesia, of forgetfulness so fast. But it doesn't mean that there are not people among the Oromo who take the false narratives, who are persuaded, who are bought off, and who do the bidding for the enemy or for those who victimize the Oromo. They have been in our history. We know them in historical period, and we know them today. Not all those who had victimized the Oromo over the last 30 years and still continue to victimize are non-Oromos. there are many Oromos there who either believe in it, who are bought off, in return for power, in return for money, in return for whatever means. Those are the ones actually who were brought forward to do something that contrary to the memory and the lived experience of the Oromo. So we shouldn't forget that. There are people within us who can do the beating for the enemy or can hurt their own people for whatever personal benefits or misguided understanding of what they are being told or what they have, because probably they didn't experience it. So I think that's the problem. It's not a matter of forgetting. But going, I think, to the next point, which also is connected to this one, about memory, about historical methodology by Dr. Desalegn. How we historians and scholars treat mythologies, myth, I think that's what he meant, in their works and how they address it. Mythologies exist. All societies do have, almost do have, by the way, of their own mythologies. We are no different from any other society. Mythologies are used for different reasons. Society uses for different reasons. In some cases, they have the kernel of truth in them. From talking from the historian's point of view, how historians treat this, particularly, in fact, this is where African historians of ancient history have actually pre-colonial history and actually specialized on, because from the European historians' point of view, the important documents that they refer to, they have a long history of literacy, is in fact the written document. All others have some kind of hierarchy, if at all they accept them. The oral traditions, the myths and others which you cannot in fact maybe prove in very concrete terms as written sources that they use, is kind of disregarded. But Africanists have developed a way of actually teasing out, getting the truth out of mythologies and views, maybe in a credible way for credible academic scholarly work. But many times they are abused. They are abused by people who don't know how to use this type of sources in a scholarly way and take them at face value and end up, in fact, make a distorted argument, or those who intentionally use it to make a wrong argument, to, as far as it benefited or it advanced their point of view, that they use it. So it's a very, in fact, delicate way. Maybe not everybody could do this. In fact, for ordinary people, either they are true, they are being accepted or being rejected. So I'm not talking about those. Scholarly, there are ways to if you can get out something plausible explanation out of them. Because when memory is fed, people end up remembering elements of the truth, elements of what actually happened. And sometimes they collapse it together of events that happened at different times and different places, and fold it into one story. That's called of a myth or a legend. Historians, anthropologists, mostly those who deal with earlier period, have ways of teasing out, separating and getting to the kernel of truth and excluding the other trappings of a legend or a myth. But for ordinary people, maybe they may not be quite clear, and so they take it and use it and misuse it. And those kinds of mythologies have been used to distort Oromo history, Oromo culture. Of course, it's true. But true scholarship, in fact, can get rid of those and come. I think, Dr. Desalegn, you mentioned about history, about the history department, which I used to be associated with early on, before maybe you were there. When I was there, and other my colleagues, for some years, when we lectured there, we dealt with the students. We were students ourselves there, and in fact, we have interaction with the students writing their senior essays, and we experienced it a lot. In fact, there was at the time, in spite of all the difficulties we had, there was a genuine effort by those of us who were very young, limited resources, and our also senior colleagues to really make that department more grounded in modern historical methodology and to improve the quality of teaching history. Of course, we didn't have the materials, the sources, and what we knew at the time, what I knew at the time is completely different what I know now. But there was an effort. I don't know what happened to it since I left in the late 1980s, mid-1980s actually. Some of them are still working. They are my colleagues. I know them. But people do change over time. I myself have for sure changed. So I don't know. I can't tell you what you guys have experienced in later on. I hear anecdotal comments where things have been going wrong. Overall, if I can comment, actually, although I'm not directly involved or know all the facts, but now universities have expanded, more history departments at those universities have been established. I'm quite sure the young historians working in those departments, at least some of them are doing their best with the limited resources and the political environment and the digital work in the same way my colleagues and myself struggled in the 1980s to do our best. But I think the overall policy seems to have changed for me, because I can see it from the very name that they use for history departments. I don't think there are that many history departments right now. They call it history and heritage studies. And by the way, there is a big difference between history and heritage. And heritage is more of celebration, while history is actually, as much as possible, a serious investigation of the historical facts and the historical reconstruction. Although you may not get fully into what actually happened hundreds and thousands of years ago, but get closer as accurately as possible to those facts and reconstruct them in the form of modern historical history texts. But right now, I think most of the history departments in the country are actually moving in the direction of more finding out more events to celebrate, meaning selecting or picking what each group considers the best traditions of its own, the best heritage of its own, so that, in fact, maybe forgetting. Look at the whole idea of this whole effort spent by the Prime Minister renovating the palace, which is actually seen by the population at large from entirely different poles, different angles. I'm quite sure when renovating, they are not putting all those negative things that were like what Dr. Mokri has been presenting today. They are erasing and wiping out all those, and in fact, putting all the positive things out there for people to come and see. So what do you do when you go and see all the polished and positive things? You come up with an entirely different interpretation, different understanding of what Milik did than when you look at or read what Professor Mokria just presented to us. If they put all those, all the negative and the positive things together for people to look at it and judge, that's one thing. But I think it's not, because it's about celebrating, it's about heritage, the popular things, and attracting tourists. It's not accuracy about historical facts. So that's the problem we have, and I think history department is moving in that direction, and probably historians, young historians trained in that mold will have a difficult time actually to be good historians unless they, in fact, find their own way to get out of it. And finally, in fact, Imiru's question about Barara and what I just said, it did exist. Well, here is the issue. I'm quite sure everything I said, or all of us said today, could be twisted and could be represented a different way that I've been talking about earlier. It's not what you said. It's what someone wants to do. They can twist and misrepresent what you said. But what I said is this. I know for sure the town was there because I see it, I read it in some of the documents. But so far I know that town was not that of a big one that really represented in the book that just came out, and I shared some of it with you. But acknowledging that the town existed doesn't make the Amhara kings the owners of it, or the land. That the current generation of Amharas as the direct inheritors of it. In fact, surprisingly, that's the way that it was represented in the book, a couple of chapters there. A very common term that we have been hearing lately in the media is Ristmas Mellis. That's what actually the author uses in this book. He says the kings, the Christian kings, Abyssinian kings, have been struggling to restore, to reclaim the Rist land that the Oromo had taken away from them after the 16th century. But my point is this. Yes, there are historical evidences. They have been there between the 14th and the early 16th century. Yes, that town, Barara, was there for a while. But what I'm saying, if I've just listened to me, and everybody, I think I want to listen to me carefully on this one. I'm not approving or saying that there is this historical claim. This is, what I'm saying is the Oromo had been there. That's what Professor Mokria did, Muhammad Hassan did. The Oromo had been there on the land. They were conquered in the 14th century. That was the first conquest that Milik repeated in the 19th century. That's the second conquest. The first conquest ended in the 16th century when they rebuffed, they pushed off and reclaimed the land which was losing to the conquering army of the Christian kings of the late medieval period, 14th, 15th century. Also, in fact, we have gone over time, way over. Let me just read this one to you. This is a book by Professor Tadesse Tamrat, who was an expert on medieval Ethiopian history, who unfortunately, in fact, didn't recognize and acknowledge the presence of the Oromo on the land at the time. I don't think, because since I've studied with him and worked with him, I know he's a man of historian of people will disagree with me, but curiosity. But at least he didn't recognize, he didn't acknowledge. I wish he lived longer and to learn more about where we are today. But this is what he says. He concluded his book with. He said, Ethiopian history has a particular tendency to repeat itself. The military exploits of King Amdeseon, this is early 14th century Abyssinian king, who conquered all those places I mentioned for the first time. The military exploits of King Amdeseon the military exploits of King Amdeseon strongly remind one of the achievements of the Aksumite kings, Izana and Caleb, 1,000 years before that, before Amdeseon. And they said more recently, he continues, more recently in the 19th century, the extensive conquest and expansion of Amdeseon, which I said is the first conquest of the Oromo, of Amdeseon. I'm sorry, to make it clear, it's not Tadesse saying that that's the first conquest. I'm saying that, but anyhow, he's talking about the conquest of Amdeseon. More recently, in the 19th century, the extensive conquests and expansion of Amdeseon were dramatically reenacted by Menelik, Emperor Menelik, who, just like the 14th century predecessor, had a Shuan plateau as a center of these military activities. And he says, this remains to be seen, however, whether Menelik and his successors have been able to successfully, have been more successful than their medieval counterpart in the essential task of building an Ethiopian nation. So basically, in fact, he admits what Menelik did in the 19th century was what Amdeseon did in the 14th century.
Okay.
But before that, let me finish the sentence. Before that, though, to be clear, the Oromo were already on the land. So there is nothing that the current generation of Amhara elites say, well, we conquered you in the 14th century, and therefore we have the right to conquer you again. That's not modern world human history goes. Well, I think the 20th century is much different from the 14th century or the 19th century. And that's where we are right now. In fact, I think we're the Oromo people fighting back and say, you can't conquer us, reconquer us this certain time. So that's, I think, where I end.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Buluma. This is a very interesting subject, and we can be here and talk for the whole day. But I think it's good to come to a conclusion, and I would like to ask Dr. Bagairu to conclude the session, please. Dr. Bagairu, on mute.
Okay, I'm sorry. Thank you very much for facilitating this session. That is excellent. Let me take this opportunity to thank everybody in this room for your immense patience and tolerance. From the height of 70-something participants, we only lost about 5 or 6, even though we are 1 hour and 1 minute late according to our schedule. We are not proud of that record. We promise you for the next time, we're going to make it much better and try to end it on time. I also like to take this opportunity to thank the moderators for the amazing job you have done. Extremely grateful to our presenters of today who burnt midnight light to come up with excellent presentations. I think the fact that it's outstanding presentation and conversation is clear from the number of people who started this journey and still remain in the room listening to you. So thank you so much for the outstanding job. And I also want to thank certain individuals, particularly the executive committee of the Oromia Global Forum, who have been working behind the scene to make this happen. I'm especially grateful to a person who I call the most important asset for our community, Moa. You probably haven't heard his name today at all, but he is an amazing person who has been doing behind the scene to make this conference happen. I'm very grateful to him and very grateful to Obo Zalalam and Obo Jamal for amazing work. This was a team effort. Everybody chipped in, and I think our audience are glad that they participate. But that is not enough. We have much better stuff lined up for you for tomorrow. And I want to take this opportunity to ask each and every one of you, when you go back, distribute the invitation that you have received from us today to all your friends, colleagues, and family members. Use your listserv. Please reach out to everybody to participate. It's a great, valuable lesson that we're learning. And hopefully many of our people, even if we don't get many people from outside, but our Oromos will turn up and listen to this great conference. With that, on behalf of OGF, OSA, the Horn of Africa, Human Rights Watch, and did I forget another organization? 4 of them. I'm extremely grateful. Over to you, Jamal, to wrap up and close.
All right. Thank you so much, Dr. Baharo. And we thank also the whole audience, the participants who have been following the whole program, asking very important questions, and those who have also presented the best contenders. And for all of us who to learn also from them, sitting all this time and listening to lectures is not an easy thing at this age of ours. Dr. Baharo, thank you so much for moderating, coordinating all of this, and other moderators as well. So this program will continue tomorrow. It has not ended. There are more important topics to come up. Please do not hesitate and bring your friends, your family members, and also your contacts. Like Dr. Baharo said, please share the link to this conference, to this Zoom room the same way as tomorrow with all of your contact list. And also tell people to follow us online. There is a Facebook page for this one. And also visit our webpage in case there will be any kind of update. I sent, the same link. Use the same link for tomorrow. And let's send you. We'll send shortly before the conference started tomorrow morning too. In case the link changes, you can just check your email and join us. So for today, I think we'll wrap up with this one. The 4 organizations that Dr. Baharo mentioned was OGF, Oromo Scholars and Professionals, OSA, Oromo Studies Association, and Horn of Africa Genocide Watch. So we organized this collaboratively, and we would like to other organizations also join us to be part of OGF in case there is someone who has not yet joined. And also, please, I was posting our email addresses to contact us. I think many of you have seen maybe in the chat room. So if we don't have your email list, we would like to have your email in our list so that you can receive communications from us in the future. Send us your email addresses and we'll contact you. So for today, I think we'll do this. Thank you so much for being with us, and we will continue being as a family very strong. So we should get really strong, defend ourselves against all odds. So martikesa no baye galatoma ol fadda sinin jenna waan diinin nurratti dalag hujuma kennan irraanna hujii baye hojjechuu qabna jabaachuu qabna ummata hagana gahu kan Afrikaa keessatti lakkoofsatiin tokkoffaaf lammaffaa kan immoo namarraa boo'u kan humna isaa gadi jiru irraa boo'u waaqni nun godhani kana jala akka baanu hojjechuu qabna. Humni keenya tokko taanaan wanni jalaan baaneef illee hin jiru. biyya keenya dhiisiitii nama biraatiif gargaarsa ta'uu dandeenya jechaadha. Humna keenya haa walitti qindeeffannu qindoomina guddaa nu barbaachisa. Fayyaa ta'a boroo nagaan sa'a 11 akka Washington DC'tti walitti adeemnu ulfaadhaa kanuma.
Civil